Hello, I'm back and I'm going to read chapter 10. I think I skipped over this chapter, but it's an important chapter and it talks about the birth of Prince Richard and Prince William and the the outbreak of World War II and its impact on the increase of duties on Alice as the Duchess of Gloucester. It also talks about, I believe it talks about some of the abdication of King Edward VIII and how Edward had to step up as the next oldest brother and help out and support King George the Sixth. He was destined to a life in the military, and he did do that, but I'm going to share like a picture of the brothers. Okay, in this picture we see this is the Duke. He was supposed to be the king. He abdicated. And then this is King George the Sixth. We know he was the next oldest brother. And then after that, the next oldest brother was Prince Henry. He was the Duke of Gloucester. And apparently this is Prince George, and him and the Duke of Gloucester were close. They had a lot of similarities, and the Duke of Windsor actually taught Prince George how to have a purpose in his life with helping out the poor and helping out those in mining towns. He really wanted to make a difference with his life and help out the less privileged. And I have to say, I do believe that is one virtue of the Duke of Windsor at the time, but I don't know if he was really cut out to be the king because that is a great responsibility. So, what I'm going to do is read chapter 10, and there are 15 chapters, so we're just about done. But in the last days of peace, Prince Henry was much with the king. Harry and George have dined with me nearly every night, he wrote to Queen Mary on the 28th of August. I've seen more of them in the last week than I have during the year. On the 30th of August, I wrote telling her that Harry went to the War Office with Bertie this afternoon and saw all sorts of interesting things. Just what these things were, he was doubtless not at liberty to tell. 4 days later, the war was declared. We decided to return to Barnwell, and on the 10th of September, I wrote again to my mother-in-law with a description of the harvesting. It has been rather exhausting as the weather has been so close and muggy. Harry and any of the available grooms, footmen, and chauffeurs have been helping to load the wheat onto the carts and stack it, and Eva and various maids and myself have been putting the newly cut pieces into stooks. We are covered with bites from the harvest bugs, I suppose, and I go on, and I've been asked to have a hospital supply depot here. Each village has a working party, and we shall have to send them the materials and the patterns from here, and then collect the finished articles to pack up and send off. In the coming 5 years, I was to visit the hospital supply depots all over the country. On the 12th of September, Prince Henry was formally appointed Chief Liaison Officer, the British Field Force, and 2 days later was on his way to a secret destination in France with Lord Gort, his chief staff, and the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force. He returned for a few days in November. The blackout was already in operation, and one evening we delivered some top-secret papers to the War Office. While Prince Henry handed these over in person, I sat waiting in the back of our official car in the gloom of the outside. Suddenly, Horribilisha, then Minister of the War, came hurrying down the steps, took our car to be his official one, and the next minute found himself sitting on my lap. I do not know which of us got the bigger surprise. He retreated in a great fluster, and I was still giggling at the thought of it when Prince Henry came out. Apart from this leave and two others, equally brief, Prince Henry was to be away until just before the fall of Dunkirk. Within weeks of the declaration of war, circumstances and attitudes have changed dramatically. On the 16th of September, I wrote to Queen Mary reporting the loan of our horse box as an ambulance and that numerous workmen still seemed to wander in and out of the house, finishing various jobs at their leisure. The war is made into an excuse for everything. It was also considered to increase the extent of my public duties. By the 11th of October, I had already accepted the presidency of the hospital supply branch of the Red Cross to add to my responsibilities as colonel in chief of the two regiments. One was the King's Own Scottish Borders, and the other was the Northamptonshire Regiment and commandant of the St. John's Ambulance Association and Brigade. In 1941, I was appointed Air Chief Commandant of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. I was soon busy visiting first aid posts and organized by the St. John's Ambulance Association, and later the WAAF at RAF stations. Meanwhile, trying to push through the modernization and redecoration of Barnwell, which was still barely habitable. Though increasingly hampered in this work and by the restraints of rationing and the lack of workmen. Queen Mary had been moved for safety's sake from London to Badminton in the depths of the Gloucestershire countryside. Here, at the home of the Duke of Beaufort, she had a private suite of rooms, her own household, and a platoon of soldiers as a bodyguard. But she missed her life in London. She kept herself and the men busy by organizing what she called her wooding. It was a daily session of clearing a wood near the house of undergrowth and unsightly timber, fallen and standing. I hope you and Eva will help with the gardening and the old clothes, she wrote. Before I visit her for the first time that autumn, we have got far beyond the ivy. Whole trees and shrubs came down in no time. We maintained a weekly correspondence throughout the war and later when I went to Australia. It acts as a diary of that time, and all the quotations here have been taken from it. I joined the King and Queen's family party at Sandringham for the Christmas party. Prince Henry was in France, and Queen Mary was prevented from coming by due to a heavy cold, which was much to her disappointment. I hope you had a pleasant time and missed me a little, she wrote plaintively on the 27th of December. I reassured her we certainly had, and early in the new year I was rewarded with an "I'm glad you enjoyed Christmas" at Sandringham, and missed me a little. With my brother Billy as his ADC, Prince Henry was occupied visiting our troops all over the north of France, narrowly missing death from enemy bombs on more than one occasion. It was therefore to my relief, though as a soldier to his disappointment, that after Dunkirk he was withdrawn from the battle area. It was a grim period, though I was cheered up en route between some engagements when I stopped for lunch with Lord Lonsdale, an old friend who was wearing his usual fanciful selection of clothes. Extravagantly embroidered waistcoat, huge straw hat surmounting flowing white hair, and it made his ponies and dogs go through their famous repertoire of tricks for my amusement. When in London, I stayed at Buckingham Palace. The King and Queen kindly gave us rooms when our official residence at York House was taken over by the Red Cross as a center for packing the POW parcels. One night, Queen Wilhelmina arrived as a refugee from Holland. She had literally run from her palace in her nightgown and somehow had been spirited onto a British warship and brought to London. There she was, a forlorn figure, and little more than a mackintosh with a possession with not a possession to her name. That evening, when the footman called in his customary way to ask whether I would prefer to dine alone, or with the king and queen, he added, Queen Wilhelmina may be joining her majesty, though only in a frock can be found for her to wear. She was a rather large lady, and none could be found to fit her. A great fear concerning the royal family throughout the war was that the Germans would parachute in and kidnap us. Never at any time, however, were we given instructions as to what to do in this event. The only innovation, as far as I was concerned, was the arrival, almost from the outset of war, of a detective, a Welshman soon nicknamed the Faithful Corgi, who came with his family to live at Barnwell and accompanied me everywhere I went for the next 5 years. At Barnwell, the male servants and employees were conscripted into the forces, so I was left with only old people who, nevertheless, manfully dug up the greater part of the garden and turned it over to potatoes. It was sad to see the flower beds that we had cherished and destroyed in this way, but it was not a very serious sacrifice in the circumstances. My secretary kept rabbits, which meant that we were forever picking dandelions. At the height of the Battle of Britain, I reported that our splendid neighbor, Lady Ethel Wickham, had given us a helping hand in shooting the partridges. It is wonderful that she can still tramp through the turnips at her age. I don't think she shot very many, but was better than no other gun. Lady Ethel was 90 at the time. In Victorian days, she'd been one of the best horsewomen and riders to hounds in England, and rather frowned up in consequences. Her father, Lord Huntley, 60 years of age at her birth, had fought at Waterloo, and her grandfather danced with Marie Antoinette. She gave William a redwood tree to plant, Metasequoia gypsalotroboides, because she thought it would be amusing for him in his old age to tell his grandchildren that it had been given to him by someone whose father had fought at Waterloo. It is apparently the fastest growing tree in the world, and it continues to flourish to the extent of 3 feet of growth a year. Other shots were also to the fore. On the 1st of November, I passed on the news that my brother-in-law, Charles Phipps, who's over 50, is in charge of 16 anti-aircraft guns near Nottingham, which is really rather a good effort. He's a very slow and rather bad shot at pheasants, but we hope perhaps that he may find German airplanes easier to hit. My news on the 12th of November was more dramatic. Dearest Mama, I wonder if you have heard that the York House had a bomb drop just outside on Sunday night. It fell in Cleveland Road, where there is now a huge crater actually touching the house. Marvelous to relate, the house has suffered very little damage and must be very strongly built and much more solid than we expected it to be. A piece of pavement about 2 feet square by 4 inches thick was flung into the lady-in-waiting's room and landed on the writing table. Needless to say, there was not much left of the writing table. Another huge jagged piece of concrete, rather larger than a football, landed in the spare bedroom. A water main burst and flooded the courtyard and some of the basement. I believe masses of bits and pieces went shooting right over the house and landed in the courtyard. We both went to London yesterday, as I had to visit the dentist, among other things, and Harry went to lunch with General Dill before going on to the Dover district. So we were greeted with the news of the bomb when we looked in at YH. We were eventually given a flat next to the Lansdowne Club with an underground bomb shelter to which we would go to when there was a raid. This shelter had been prepared for the King and Queen in the event of having to abandon Buckingham Palace. It was therefore as secure and well appointed as anything could be. At Barnwell in the summer, we had the first intimations that we would be required to take in evacuee children from London, and by the autumn they had arrived, 2 little boys in the main house, now largely habitable, and their sister with our butler, West, and his wife, who had a little house alongside. The boys stayed in the staff quarters. The cook helped to look after them most of the days, and also my secretary, who with myself gave them exercise by playing cricket out on the lawn. They also read to them before they were tucked into their beds before the night. One morning they got up at 4 o'clock with the intention of walking back to London. We luckily went in the wrong direction and soon got tired. When reprimanded, they said the country was so dull they wanted to see more of the raids and bombs. After a few months, it was decided that it was safe enough for them to return home. Later, when there was a renewed bombing, we had 2 more from Islington. 30 years later, when William was killed, the girls wrote a note of sympathy. So I replied and invited her to Barnwell for the day with her husband and their several children. She remembered my maid, who was still with us, and recalled the little frock she had made for her out of a velvet curtain. Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, was staying at the time and talked about her evacuees. I think the visit was a great success. Certainly I enjoyed it. My worst experience of bombing was being taken on a tour of the country 2 days after the notorious raid that destroyed much of the town, including the cathedral. As we visited one factory, an air raid warning went off, and the Lord Lieutenant of Warwickshire, who was taking us around, asked me if I would prefer to go to an underground shelter or to continue the tour. This was a very awkward question. But I hated shelters, so I said I should much rather be bombed on the top than buried underground, so long as that did not prevent other people from taking refuge. Splendid, he said. It will set a very good example to the workers. They're apt to dash to the shelters at the slightest excuse. So we continued on the round, and luckily no raid occurred. There was an awful communal grave they asked me to go and look at, where they had sadly had to bury hundreds of people anonymously. Prince Henry and myself continued to keep up the busy schedule of tours and inspections, usually independently of each other. This could lead to anxieties, as when I reviewed some military maneuvers that by March, my regiment, the 6th KOSBs, an airplane came along and dropped out of the clouds some red smoke, some sort of sham gas, which luckily blew up in the opposite direction and not over us. In the afternoon, they staged a very amusing sham fight in a little valley, which I believe the men all thoroughly enjoyed, as they were allowed to use real bombs, which usually was not permitted. Shortly after I left, there were machine guns in one of the villages where I had been inspecting. When Harry returned to the division HQ that evening, a message was handed to the general to say that the unit had been machine gunned. So Harry, who knew that I was with them that day, got a horrid shock till he discovered by telephone that I had left an hour or more before it happened. A memorable exception to this division of our duties was when we both visited Belfast from the 21st to the 24th of April in 1941. The visit, as usual on such occasions, was kept secret beforehand, and I had to wear a uniform for the flight, so that if the plane was shot down and I fell into empty hands, I should be treated as a prisoner of war. It so happened that the city was bombed for the first time on the night of the 20th of April. It proved a great deal surprise because the Lord Haw Haw had said that Germans would never bomb Belfast, since they wanted the shipyards undamaged when they themselves took over. Accordingly, no one had bothered much with air raid precautions. The bombers had greatly increased the scale of the disaster by making the glint of the city's reservoirs in the moonlight for the shipbuilding yards, thus dropping most of their bombs on residential areas. When we appeared the following day, it looked as if we had come in answer to the raid. As a result, we were given an extraordinarily heartfelt and even hysterical welcome. The hysteria was not surprising. The smell of the blown up houses was terrible. Rubbish was burning, sewers were broken, one could hardly breathe, and everybody's face was embedded with a peppering from the blast. The people were so overwhelmed in their welcome that the police decided it was safe to let us walk amongst the crowds, which they would never allow before. Visiting the hospitals in particular, one noticed the inadequacy of the air raid precautions. There were no sandbags or buckets, no netting or blackout paper over the windows. The newly blinded men were the most painful casualties to meet, and I was almost overcome with emotion myself when a young man who had just lost his sight would not let go when I took his hand. In another hospital, an old man was suffering from shell shock and had hysterics when a tactless cameraman took a flashlight photograph in his face as I was talking at the bedside. May brought confirmation that I was again expecting a baby. On the 31st, Queen Mary wrote, "I was so thrilled and delighted of your good news this morning that I nearly fell off my dressing table in my excitement." She was very exercised on my behalf with everything to do with the baby, and she would advise me, "Fortnum and Mason are so expensive that I think you had better go elsewhere for the cradle. Just what part of the baby's layette would be bought with coupons and without particular trouble, which what without particularly troubled her. Do you know, I think it very difficult to order the layette in this tiresome way. I mean by letter. And you do not tell me how many you want of the various items, so I return to you the Stitchery school list with the items marked with 1, 2, 3, and a separate list for you to put down. How many you require of each item, what kind of material, what length. And please, you must give me all the material, as I know the school will be unable to get you what you require. And please let me have lace and trimmings. I enclose a check for £50 for the various things by the Stitchery School, as well as for doing up the cots and baskets. I hope I have made myself clear. Alas, I clearly failed to rise to the occasion because on the 19th of August, the 2 months of plans were finally ditched. Dear Alice, thank you for this morning's letter. After all, the complications of ordering what you want from the School of Stitchery beats me. So I'm returning to you the box of patterns and silk you sent me a few days ago. It's unopened, so will you please order them direct? A couple of weeks before the birth, there was another present forthcoming. at this time with a rather difficult result. A kind South African doctor had sent me a case of oranges, but Lord Woolton will not allow me to have it. Harry is furious. A rather curt letter from the Lord W.'s secretary to say that no one is allowed to send presents weighing more than 2 pounds or above 5 oranges, so he regrets that I cannot have them. All the various wartime restrictions applied, of course, as much to the royal family as anybody else. In this particular case, perhaps a bit more. William was born on the 18th of December. His delighted father got compassionate leave over the days of his birth, but soon he had to return to the 20th Armored Brigade in Scotland, where he was acting second in command to Brigadier Evelyn Fanshawe. On the 9th of February, Queen Mary wrote systematically, "It's a pity Harry is so far away from you at present, as I know what a lot of things you want to settle things, which one cannot do alone without one's husband's valuable advice. Besides, it's nice to talk things over together, don't you think? This is what I miss so dreadfully for Papa, and I always talked and discussed things." He was back in the south, however, for the christening, which duly took place at Windsor on the 22nd of February. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony in the names chosen. It was William Henry Andrew Frederick. The sponsor was the King, Queen Mary, Princess Helena Victoria, Lady Margaret Hawkins, Lord William Scott, and Viscount Gort, who was unable to attend because of military commitments. Once more, Prince Henry had to disappear to the north. What a pity Harry will miss 3 months of the baby's adorable baby days, which one simply loves, commiserates Queen Mary, especially the first one. You cannot think how Papa enjoyed our first baby, that naughty boy being David. He was always in and out of the nursery. Prince Henry was even farther away throughout the summer on a diplomatic mission of the Near and the Middle East of India, landing back on the 4th of August at one of the new American Air Force bases close to Barnwell. He returned unexpectedly, and as no one could decipher the coded notice of his arrival, beyond the fact that it clearly announced someone of considerable importance, and because Cary Grant was rumored to be on his way to the base as a rear gunner, the press gathered on the runway to scoop the first pictures of the famous film star on foreign service. When they saw Prince Henry emerge, therefore, they were disappointed. "Oh, it's not him," and they vanished before he put a foot on the tarmac. We subsequently traveled to Drumlanrig for a shooting holiday. Leaving William, we went for a visit at Balmoral. The drive from Dumfriesshire up to the Deeside proved to be a nightmare because of the dense fog all the way. As I was sitting next to the king at dinner that night, someone came and asked if he could take an important call. We were all left in silence at the table, each one of us, and particularly Queen Elizabeth, suspecting something awful had happened. Okay, this is where they get the news of Prince George dying in the airplane. It was very sad. The king came back and sat in silence. I could feel he was in deep distress. And soon the queen caught my eye, signaling me to rise with her and lead the ladies from the room. In the drawing room, we were all assumed that the news must be of Queen Mary's death, not imagining anything else more awful that could have happened. Then the Queen left us and came back with the King and told us that it was the Duke of Kent who'd been killed. He was killed in an air crash earlier that day. We all traveled by a special train to Windsor for the funeral, and then back again to Balmoral because there seemed nothing else to do. After a day or two, however, we returned to Drumlanrig for William, and we were jolted back into the routine practicalities of the present by news that our chauffeur had got drunk and driven into the river with a Drumlanrig odd job man. When we discovered that he had frequently been drunk in friends' houses, but they'd never liked to tell us. From Barnwell on the 23rd of September, I complained that the weeds are terrible and our lawns are all shaggy and unknown, and the yew hedges were covered with long whiskers. It makes one sad to see everything getting into such a state, but it just can't be helped. But this did not put off visitors. On the 11th of October, I reported that I've just looked out the window and seen about 50 or more Americans having their photographs taken against the old castle. Quite uninvited, the Americans from the local aerodromes enjoyed visiting the gardens that soon we left it open for anyone to come and wander around. One fair-haired young airman particularly liked it, and over the months was accorded some privileges like picking himself strawberries if he felt inclined. He used to come over regularly for his strolls, so when one evening, as I was hurrying back to the house to give William his bath, it seemed quite in order when I heard him say, "Can I look around again?" I thought nothing of it, really, even when I turned to reply and found no one there. "That's odd," I amused. I am sure he said something, but there was no time to look for him, so I hurried on. Afterwards, I heard that it was on this day that he'd been shot down and killed on a bombing mission over Germany. Meanwhile, baby William prospered, almost too much for his grandmother's liking. We wrote William was walking already. On the 30th of November, he's walking much too soon, so don't let him get bandy-legged. In the new year of 1943, I confirmed that he hardly ever cries, which is such a blessing, and is very good at amusing himself with bricks and a little toy on wheels made by our chauffeur's son, which he pulls along the floor. He does not bother me to play with him all the time like some children. 2 months later, he's always covered with bruises and scratches, as he's very inquisitive and venturesome and will climb under and over and on everything. Usually he's in a hurry and then trips over something and takes a crash. But he is very brave and never cries much. He loves animals and has no fear of them at all. He gives carrots to the horses, who put their heads right into the pram. We have a 3-week-old bull calf, and he runs into the stall and strokes and pats it. In May, we took him to see Queen Mary. We did all enjoy our week at badminton so very much. William has put on a pound, and Harry suspects he's put on several pounds. In September, we also visited my mother at her new home and Brack's home near Bowhill, where she had retired after the death of my father. Here, in old age, she continued to be as otherworldly as ever, telephoning Billy in a panic when her checkbook was finished because she thought it meant she had no more money left. She also became rather eccentric. When she opened her garden in the spring, she would pick bunches of daffodils at Bowhill. Then she'd stick them in the ground back at sprang home in hope of making a better showing. As for the house itself, she added a very inappropriate conservatory as a sun trap, which also served as a dining room. Even when it poured with rain, the rain throughout our visit, and then since the weatherproofing of the glass was equally woebegone, there we sat in every meal, with one particular persistent drip playing on Prince Henry's head. In 1943, I was busy as ever. Eva Stanford, my lady in waiting, came at a time and was appointed the rank of flight officer. Otherwise, security arrangements would have made it impossible for her to accompany me to aerodromes. For first visiting for first For visiting first aid posts, I wore the uniform of St. John's Ambulance Association and Brigade. First aid posts were usually in private houses. They acted as a rallying post for the local VADs and St. John, and also storage centers for medical supplies. Inevitably, they tended to be run by old people. Old people drove the ambulances and served in the home guard, which really was rather like it was portrayed in Prince Henry's favorite TV program, Dad's Army. People with pitchforks did tend to be on the lookout for enemy agents dressed as nuns, but the fun kept up the morale. One WAAF station I visited was completely flooded just before my arrival, so she introduced some ducks into the sitting room to cheer the place up for my benefit. On another occasion, when inspecting a station of Lossiemouth, the commander turned to me after my tour was over and asked if I would mind if he showed me a local country house. He hoped to the commander for the WAAF in place of the prep school that they were at present squeezed into. There's very much a difficult old lady who owns it, but if she hears you've been and approved, ask for the house, she might let us have it, he explained. I agreed, knowing full well that arrangements for my visit had probably already been put in hand. We motored about a mile till we arrived at a rather grim house, with an avenue of dark yew trees and a reception by Air Force personnel on the front steps, one of whom I said, "I'm afraid old Miss Dunbar has appeared. She's not been seen for ages. She's usually bedridden, but I'm afraid she's got up." In the hall, all the blinds were drawn and the place was lit by a gas lamp. Although outside it was broad daylight, Miss Dunbar, a tall old lady dressed head to foot in black, received me, explaining as if in recognition. "Miss Hannah," everyone was aghast. The commander tactfully explained who I was, whereupon Miss Dunbar also looked aghast, and I was hurried away to look at the house. A sinister experience, with the blinds having to be pulled up in every room to let in the light. In the end, I decided the WAAF would do better staying in their crowded school. By the time we finished seeing over the house, the old lady had disappeared. I went on to stay with an aunt in Nairn. When I told her of my strange experience of the afternoon, she looked very intrigued. "Oh, you must have met old Miss Mad Dunbar. Nobody's seen her for years. She's always supposed to know if anyone with Stuart blood is coming to the house, and then she appears. And of course, through the Duke of Monmouth, the Scots do have Stuart blood." The WAAF did take over the house, but did not stay long before they found it so haunted. The air bases around Barnwell brought their own hazard. One day I was in my sitting room when an airplane came over very low, making a dreadful noise and trailing smoke and flames. William was asleep in his pram on the lawn. Somebody at the upstairs window shouted, "It'll be down in a minute, that plane." I reached William just as the explosion of the crash occurred about a mile away, and the pram leapt out of my hands, but it remained upright and William did not wake. However, when Nanny went to fetch him later, he asked, "Is Aeroplane all right?" Another time, when he was strolling about on a rug on the lawn, a plane passed between the house and the old sycamore tree that stands about 60 yards away, knocking a branch off, but amazingly, the pilot succeeded in gaining height and flew onto its aerodrome. The noise of the planes had a very noticeable effect on animals. At the beginning of the war, all hunters were commandeered for the service in North Africa. A very sad moment, and we were left with 2 polo ponies, who both proved susceptible to the vibration of aircraft engines. If one of our planes passed overhead, they paid no attention. But when a German one did, they began to tremble and get fidgety. German engines made a different sound, a num, a num, a num, and the ponies recognized this and associated it with danger. It was the same with the bull mastiff we had. He was terrified of German planes, wriggling under the bed or sofa as soon as he heard them coming. We were in the line of their raids to Coventry and the Midland cities, and the shock waves of the bombs would set the pheasants crowing before we heard the bombs explode. We were too far away for the house to shake, but once a plane jettisoned 3 bombs quite near us on the way back to Germany. We had our casualties like everyone else. "We are feeling very sad," I wrote on the 1st of August 1944, "as our extremely nice, reliable, and capable farm manager worker and everything else has been killed in that ward of 7 people at the Moorfield Eye Hospital. He had a piece of shrapnel in his eye during the last war and has had to have it treated from time to time. It had got worse lately, and he was anxious to have this treatment done between the haymaking and the harvest. He was dissatisfied with the doctor in Northampton who had treated him a year or 2 ago and was particularly anxious to see somebody really good in London. With much difficulty, and most unluckily as it happened, we arranged for him to get a bed at this hospital. The eye turned out to be worse than he ever suspected, and instead of being there for a few days, he'd already been a week. And in all unlucky things, this flying bomb went and crashed on top of his ward. Harry is miserable, and he feels he should have dissuaded him from going to London. Our fear of being kidnapped remained to the end. Grounds for suspicion were increased by reports that our cousin, Lord Harewood, was being held as a hostage in Colditz. Once William arrived, it was always my greatest worry to know what to do with him in a moment that I came. I had a plan with a local farmer's wife that I would hurry across to her with him, and that she would stay with her little grandchild and keep till the war was over. We also made a shelter in the old castle near the house, so we realized it would be unlikely to avail as much in the event of a real assault. We knew in our hearts that there were really no precautions to be taken that would be of much avail. Like everyone else, we tried to carry on as normal a life as circumstances allowed. In the sporadic moments that the Prince Henry and I were together, we found our greatest relaxation in going out and helping on the farm. Occasionally, I would visit Queen Mary at Badminton, accompanying her to a little book binding shop she particularly liked in Bath, and in search of antiques of which she had great knowledge, and especially when it concerned anything to do with the family. Otherwise, we would be out wooding. This she enjoyed very much, especially tugging away the ivy from the trunks of the trees. Then one day in the winter of 1943, a sad letter arrived from her saying that most of the woods that had been blown down in a gale, so that all her wooding had been unnecessary. However, she soon found a new wood area and started off again with undiminished enthusiasm. In 1943, brought news that I was expecting another baby, and also that Prince Henry was to replace Lord Gowrie as the Governor General of Australia in the near future. Richard was born in August, and he was duly christened Richard Alexander Walter George at Windsor. And that is the end of chapter 10. And that is quite an experience that they had during World War II. And I am reading all of this because I think with the VE Day coming up, we do need to remember everything that everybody in England and all over the world had gone through during World War II times. I mean, my mom was a child in World War II, and it's left very devastating effects. And it's interesting to see how the royals were. They weren't into their prim and proper, fancy way of life. They were trying to survive. They were going to hospitals. They were trying to lend help where they could. They were under threat too, of getting bombed. And it was such a different time. We need to remember what everybody goes through during a war. So, and that is the end of chapter 10. And you will read more about their time in Australia in chapter 11.